agree, but honestly, I feel like the real option is probably no pads, no helmet.
Well,
the same
like
thing with
rugby.
MMA.
Or like the original football in the U.S.
Well, I think with MMA, one of the things that saves fighters versus boxing is that you really can't tee off on someone the way you can with boxing gloves. With boxing gloves, you almost can have no concern with whether or not you're going to hit a forehead or you're going to hit an elbow, unless you have small hands or weak hands. Like, it's much more rare that boxers break their hands than MMA fighters. But even MMA fighters, I think they have an unrealistic amount of protection on their hands, and it's just to protect their hands. Like, I still, to this day, I'll get interviews. Like, I got interviewed after that the guy died overseas really recently, and they were saying, do you think that they maybe should have bigger gloves, or maybe we should make people wear headgear? I think the real answer is no gloves. Not only no gloves, no wrist taping. Because I think that one of the more difficult aspects about punching someone is that your wrist joint moves when you hit things. And it makes it way harder. I mean, you have to really concentrate to keep your fist completely tight, make sure that your wrist doesn't move when you make impact. And you have to make impact with the first two knuckles primarily, otherwise you could break your hand. And
well, like the original UFC. I was one of the original investors. I told you this.
Mm-hmm.
I actually threw my little bit of money in there and was Hoyce's conditioning coach for those first three.
What did you have him do back then?
I was actually trying to build his strength as much as I could because jiu-jitsu provided all of the conditioning that he needed. He was doing a lot of work with, just bringing in fresh partners and, and he wanted to stay a jiu-jitsu purist. Although, he used some kicks and so forth just to kind of
close the distance.
Just close the distance, fake the guy out, make the guy wonder, like, what's he doing, so that he could get the clinch and so forth.
He would smack guys, too, to open up things where you don't run the risk of breaking your hand.
But in all those original UFCs, the strikers all busted their hands. A lot of them did. There was, I think 3 broken hands in that first the first one.
Well, that's realistic, though. And
that's realistic. And ground and pound would cease to exist.
Yeah.
You can't just sit there and tee off.
Well, you could elbow people for sure,
you
just
could
as
elbow
much.
people. But imagine hitting someone in the elbow with your fist or at the top of the head.
Yeah.
So that whole ground and pound thing would pretty much go away.
Well, just reckless punching would go away.
You would have to have precision punches. You'd see a lot more open hand strikes. You would see grapplers able to secure holds that they can't hold.
Yes.
It might be boring for the public because I think you would see grapplers win a lot of fights.
You might, but I think you would also see a lot better Muay Thai. You would see people would have to develop their Muay Thai because you wouldn't see any change in the weapons. The knees, the kicks, the elbows, all would be exactly the same. The only difference would be the punches. So I think a really high-level Muay Thai practitioner would probably
really
have they'd probably have a really good advantage if they can keep the fight on the feet. If the fight went to the ground, you definitely see a big advantage for grapplers, especially in securing chokes, because you've tried, I'm sure, to grapple with MMA gloves on.
Oh, my God, it's just like wearing oven mitts or something.
Especially like rear nakeds. If you try to get a rear naked choke, try to get the hand
behind the neck.
Even a good
guillotine sometimes is really hard to get it underneath the chin and so forth.
Yeah, and especially if you like pretzel grips or something like that, it's there's so much padding. There's so much. You create a good solid 2 to 3 extra inches of space that you don't want with all the padding on the gloves, and it just gets in the way. And it's easy for your opponent to grab them and pull them off.
I would love to see a return to the gloveless MMA.
Yeah,
I would love. I think it would be really interesting. I'd like to see a league somewhere, where maybe on an Indian reservation or someplace, where they didn't have all the, boxing is the reason why they put the gloves on in the first place.
Sure.
The boxing commissions all wanted, they.
Well, actually, it was Tank Abbott. Tank Abbott was the first guy to wear those gloves. Tank Abbott wore the Chuck Norris MMA gloves, which was before anybody had them. I mean, Tank wore them like, I want to say, it was like early UFCs, because Tank was a power puncher, and he was smart enough to realize, you know what? I'll just tape my hands up, put these small padded gloves on that are going to protect my knuckles, and just mollywop these dudes.
Was that before they went to the gloves?
Tank Abbott was before they went to the gloves. The first UFC that I worked, they didn't have gloves. I was at UFC 12.
And they still didn't have gloves?
They did not have gloves.
Wow,
it was not mandatory. It was optional. Vitor wore gloves, but he didn't have to. I believe he also wore shoes. No, he didn't wear them in those.
I remember that some of the guys were still wearing the wrestling shoes.
He was barefoot. He wore them when he fought Vanderlei. That's him versus Oleg Hektarov.
Okay.
See? So Oleg has no gloves, but Tank has gloves on.
Interesting.
Yeah, Tank was. I'm pretty sure Tank was the pioneer of wearing those kind of gloves, and I think that they would call those. I don't think they called them MMA gloves back then because I don't think they had the term MMA. But the original gloves were Century gloves. You know, the Century Martial Arts Supply Company
for hitting the heavy bag or the speed bag,
something like that. Yeah, and that's what the design came from. Like the design of MMA gloves didn't come from someone sitting down and saying we need the perfect glove for mixed martial arts. No, they already had a model that was really not really necessarily designed for MMA, and they just sort of applied it to MMA, and it became the standard. There's a lot of like really sloppy shit that's in MMA still to this day that shouldn't be there. That's only in there because it was in there in the beginning. The 12-6 elbow, which I harp upon all the time because I think it's so stupid that if you go down from 12 on the clock to 6 on the clock with an elbow, it's illegal. Even if you hit someone in the thigh, which is so stupid, it's illegal. And the reason why it's illegal is because the commissions, the athletic commissions, saw people breaking bricks on those karate demonstrations. Jesus. You can't do that. You would kill people. So that's why that's illegal.
Not understanding that they weaken those bricks.
Right. Well, and also the reason why gloves are mandatory is because somehow or another they erroneously believe those gloves protect the fighters. They don't.
Not at all.
But knowing that you, I mean, I think if we got a room full of athletes and fighters and martial artists, and we all had the discussion, we said, let's just have a show of hands. How many guys here think that the gloves protect the opponent?
No.
Not everybody have their hands
so
down, right? So everyone who knows, 100%, I think, across the board. I mean, there might be a contrarian or two that would step in and say, you know, hey, personally, I'd rather get punched by a guy with a glove than no glove. But most people would say, fuck that. Most people would say bare knuckles probably safer for everybody involved.
Safer. Am I correct? Did they not take the headgear off Olympic boxing?
They did.
Yeah.
They did. Yeah. Yes. And I think that's a good move. I think it's a very good move.
So too.
You don't get hit as much when you not have headgear on. I used to hate headgear sparring because your peripheral would get screwed up, especially kickboxing. It was really dangerous because you'd get hit with a jab and you wouldn't even recognize the kick was coming because they're coming over your shoulder until whomp, it's catching the side of the head. Your peripheral would get all fucked up. It would close your peripheral quite a bit, and I just always felt like I got hit way more when I had headgear on.
And you know, it's interesting. The little bit of boxing that I did do, I always noticed I always kind of had a dull headache after boxing with headgear. And when I didn't have the headgear, I didn't have that same headache. It was weird. Even back then, I could never understand why my head always hurt more after boxing with the headgear on.
Because your brain's squishing around it anymore.
Well, now I know. But I mean, at the time, I didn't put the cause and effect together. I just know all I knew was intuitively I hated wearing headgear when I would train.
Well, what's interesting when I've brought up this to people in high places, they always have the same thing. The public would never go for it. The public would think it's too brutal. People would think it's too brutal.
I don't know,
but
man.
What have we created? What have we created? Because we created something in MMA. Not me. I obviously didn't have anything to do with it. But what MMA is we have a completely new sport over the last few decades. And this completely new sport has redefined the way people think about combat sports and fighting, right? Okay. Well, why don't we be honest about what's happening? And why don't we be honest about how come you can shin kick a guy in the face? I can shin you in the face, full blast, but I can't punch you with a bare knuckle. Do you know how stupid that is? Because a guy like, take, someone who's a power kicker like a Vitor Belfort or something.
Oh, my God.
The amount of power they could generate from a kick in that raw shin to your face, it's so much more than anyone can ever punch. I mean, like multitudes more.
It's like
3, 4, 5 times more.
Basically.
It
is.
Like
a baseball bat.
But we don't have to wear shin pads. How come we don't have to wear shin pads? Because the public's not used to shins being covered. It's all it is. I really honestly think that the smartest move would be to ban tape. You can't tape your wrists, and bare knuckles.
I think so too. Well, if you go back in the early era of boxing, where it was all bare knuckle, you rarely saw knockouts. There's fights used to go so like 30 rounds sometimes.
Yeah.
All the like Jack Johnson and those guys.
Do you think that's why they used to fight like this too?
I
they
think
would
so.
like smack each other with the knuckles like that?
Yeah.
Or do you think they just didn't know any better?
I think they knew better. I don't think the mighty men of old. There's not too much we could probably show those guys. Imagine if we went in a time capsule back to Sparta, the first professional army, in Europe, right? Do you think we could actually show those guys anything about
Yes.
fighting or warfare and
I'll
stuff?
fuck all those dudes up. Send me back. No, no. Honestly,
I bet
martial
there's not,
arts.
man.
I bet they'd get fucked up. I really do. Because when I look at the martial artists from 1993 that were competing in the UFC, and then I look at the martial artists of today in 2016. Look at John Jones. Do you know what the fuck John Jones would do to UFC 1? I mean, you know how ridiculous it'd be if you send John Jones into UFC 1? He'd be like, get that guy out of here. This is not fair. Like, he's doing a totally different thing. I think the martial artists of today, like Demetrius Johnson, who I think is the best ever.
But we're still talking modern. Let's go 2,000 years ago. You put John Jones in the gladiatorial arena.
You don't think he would fuck those guys up?
I think he'd be a hell of a gladiator. You know,
I don't think
good fighters.
anyone would have a chance. I don't think they would know what they were doing.
I think they knew what they were doing.
Really?
Yeah, I
well,
really
how
do.
come they didn't know in 1993?
A lot of this information had been lost.
Right, but even jiu-jitsu, which jiu-jitsu
You know, this
has
was like a
evolved.
resurgent of like old stuff. I mean,
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying.
You know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah.
like the Dark Ages, you know, where they, you know, like in medieval times.
But they didn't have the ability to share information like they have today.
No, not at all. There's no internet or
Well,
anything
yeah,
like that.
that's one of the reasons why jiu-jitsu is at such a high level today. Like, there's all these like viral BJJ, which is one of the ones I follow on Instagram. There's a bunch of them I follow on Instagram where they'll have like moves of the day, and they show these moves, and I've been doing jiu-jitsu for a long time, and I'll watch something and I'll just go like the Home Alone guy. I'm like, oh my god,
Yeah.
like look at this fucking move. Like every day, these kids are coming up with new moves. Every
move.
day, I saw somebody figured out how to go. Some dude went from being in a heel hook to catching a guy in a Kimura, and spun out of the heel hook into a Kimura. And I was like, what?
Whoa. That's
Like,
pretty amazing stuff.
What did you just do? Like you watch it, you're like, how did it? And you just got to replay it over and over and over again. There's so many of those now.
But let's go back to what we were just talking about. In ancient times, your ability to fight was a life or death thing. Mm-hmm. You know, you were actually fighting to the death.
Right.
We don't have that.
True.
Unless you know, but usually in the military, it's with shooting and guns and stuff like that. You don't see guys fighting. I mean, it could be hand to hand, but for the most part, these guys were trained warriors that would fight hand to hand. That's why I say when you're fighting to the death, you're damn good at what you do.
If you live.
If you live.
But if you don't live, you don't get to really learn anything.
Yeah, but
You know what I mean?
but there's plenty of guys that did live.
Yeah. But
And so my point is that they were well trained and they really knew what was going on.
I think there's some good points on both sides. I think there were certainly some incredibly tough people back then, for sure.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
I'm sure the pain threshold was unbelievable.
But I think there's also this longing for nostalgia that a lot of people like to apply to like the ancient martial artists and the ancient fighters, and they like to look, oh, those guys, boy, if they could fight, today, like if you could get this guy. Look, Jack Dempsey, who's a hell of a fighter and an amazing boxer and just an unbelievably tough man, wouldn't last one round with Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson in his prime would have ran through Jack Dempsey. He would have ran through all of them. He would have ran through Gene Tunney. He would have ran through all those guys.
Of course, he ran through everybody in modern age too. So,
but
I mean, is that because he was Mike, or is it because those guys were really that bad?
Well, it was also
because he made a lot of modern guys look pretty shitty.
He certainly did, but he had the benefit of having all of those guys on film.
See,
he had his version of the internet.
I agree.
What he had is his version of the internet, which was Customato. And Customato, I mean, he might not have got him on Reddit or showed him all the funny memes on Instagram, but what he did do is he played him these films, these black and white films of Sugar Ray Robinson, of Jersey Joe Walcott, of Rocky Marciano. He got to watch these old school Jack Dempsey tapes, and he got to emulate their techniques and understand. And Customato would go over them meticulously, different positions and different ways to encounter different styles and different ways to move to get better angles for counter shots. And he learned from all those techniques in a way those guys really didn't have the opportunity to do. They had to train, they had to learn from trainers, they had to watch other people do it, but they didn't have the benefit of having a library of film that spanned decades.
You make a very strong point. Did you happen to catch him in Ip Man 3?
What is it?
Ip Man 3.
No, what is that?
The Wing Chun guy.
Okay.
Ip Man.
It was one of those crazy kung fu movies.
Yeah, but Mike Tyson had a.
Oh, that's right. I saw the previews.
Dude,
for
he
that.
looks scary as shit.
He's always scary.
Even to this day,
Yeah.
he looks like he could still. If he just trained for 6 months or so, he looks like he'd still step in there and take somebody out.
Well, he definitely.